Thank you for joining our session here on uh, Between the Lines, a call to action to address redistricting here in South Carolina. Just by a brief way of introductions and background, on behalf of the South Carolina Progressive Network, I am Vince Matthews, Public Policy Director. In case you have not met me, I am a native of James Island, South Carolina, and a Clemson Tiger graduate. But I went to law school at Pepperdine University and spent about 9 years in criminal defense, embarking on a career in as a public interest lawyer. But the last 18 years of my work has been specifically focused in the area of public policy. So I returned home back here in 2017, became connected with a member of the network, and immediately involved as a place where I could really engage and try to have some impact in the space of public policy. And at that time, we worked on the legislation for the Independent Citizens Redistricting Act. So for the past few years, it's been a bit of, my focus around that, and we are now here. And so, as you are all sort of all aware that the Senate has begun its public hearing process to obtain public input in the redistricting process. And there's been, I'll say, a number of a bit of information circulating, people wanting to sort of know how to engage. And as part of the network and our Fear Maps initiative, we have been looking at public policy solutions towards how do we address a bit of the problem here in South Carolina. And as by way of background, I had done work, like I said, on the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, but as we know, the legislature has not made any movement on that. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity of participating in a variety of voting rights at conferences on a national level to try to engage and get people participating in the process this cycle. In particular, because with I'll say, the changes that have happened, this is a very unique cycle for redistricting, because this is the first time we're not having what's called federal oversight in terms of pre-clearance. And as you are aware, the southern states that had a significant history of racial discrimination and policies for racial gerrymandering to suppress the vote. Those maps and plans used to have to go be presented to the Department of Justice for review after completed, but this cycle, that's not the case. The other factor that has sort of let's say complicated matters is that we have a delay in the census. And we all know and I'm going to assume that, the importance of the census is because every 10 years, the census, when we check for population, that we reapportion districts on both the state, federal, and local level. And it is when we reapportion those districts, that is, since we live in a representative democracy, that is what sort of determines a lot of how our representation looks like in the legislative bodies, both on the federal and state level, and in terms of our political power. So the census, which I think has sort of missed a little bit of the focus, is very much directly related to our power, the power of our vote and our political power. Now, when it comes to how districts, the reapportionment basically makes is that context is that each district must be of equal um, uh, equal population and size. But the redistricting is how the lines or the boundaries are drawn. And if you give me just a moment, I want to pull up my presentation. Danielle, you need to allow my host ability. Um, okay. Okay, and give me just a moment. Okay, and so just for a bit of context here, what I would like for everyone, when I mention political power, the South Carolina Constitution actually has a very important provision in Article 1. It says all political power is vested in the people. It's vested in and derived from the people, and therefore they have the right at all times to modify their form of government. And that is a provision that is uniquely remains from that radical constitution that was formed during Reconstruction. And I emphasize this, and we put this at the point because political power means, choosing the candidates of our choice so that we can, like I said, have a voice in forming our government. Now, what we all know is that the problem here in South Carolina is that our maps are gerrymandered. And gerrymandering is a form of voter suppression. We often don't hear or put that in context in the same way, but gerrymandering limits the power of votes. And in our state, South Carolina's legislative districts have been gerrymandered to have the least competitive elections in the nation, such that one party has an unfair advantage on election day. 70% of our legislative districts have been gerrymandered by our state legislature to offer only one major party candidate in the general election. And that's 117 out of 170 of the districts offer no voter choice. And another part that's important is that there is no state law that establishes the criteria for creating congressional and state legislative districts, and the legislature has the full power in adopting the redistricting guidelines and rules. And what they have done is the rules have given them the ability to protect themselves and their seats for reelection. Now, there's a specific provision in which I think in terms of the rules, the Senate House guidelines rules is that those rules actually provide for incumbency protection. And I pull out the provision that was in the last guidelines, and I didn't mention right here that there's the House, but the incumbency protection shall be considered in the reapportionment process such that reasonable efforts shall be made to ensure that the incumbent legislators remain in their current districts, and reasonable efforts should be made to ensure that those incumbent legislators are not placed into districts where they will be compelled to run against other incumbent members of the House. Now, when we allow our legislators to draw their own maps. This presents a conflict of interest with our political power because it gives them the freedom to pick and choose their voters. And the current process by which they do this basically makes us vulnerable to partisan bias and manipulation in a process that's not transparent and does not have um, accountability. And this is something that we need to address, and we have not been able to address this via the legislative process. I include just this illustration here, and I'm assuming that, not assuming, but just wanted to emphasize the impact and the importance of how an election can be stolen or changed by how the map is drawn. And as you see in these three, here, you have where there's red is the minority, 60% are blue, 40% is red. If we draw the map in one way, I'm sorry, you can have blue winning in an equal manner. You draw them in another unique way, you can get the minority view winning, having a majority control. That is the type of manipulation that goes on and can take place during the redistricting process. And that's what we as the people must be participating in to be able to monitor, ensure that this does not happen. I pulled this slide out in reference to showing there's been an analysis from Follow the Money that shows just that South Carolina is so far in terms of competitiveness of districts. And that is based upon gerrymandering. This illustration here is from two maps that show the general election outcomes in 2016 in the House. I'm going to highlight, look at the gray areas. The gray areas are where the House candidates won their elections by 97% of the vote or higher. The red districts I'm going to jump down to is where it was like 56 to 75%, somewhat competitive. The most competitive districts were those that were in yellow. So when we look at yellow, we see 1, 2, 3 districts. When we take a look at the general election results for the Senate, very similar. Look at the gray, 97% or higher voting. Competitive districts, only 3 in the state. Now, what I want to sort of, one of the objectives that I wanted to focus this discussion around, and what I've noticed in a lot of presentations and discussions, we've talked about the redistricting process in general terms, how it works overall. But I want to highlight some distinctions that are important in South Carolina that we must pay attention to. South Carolina is the only state in the nation with no state law or constitution that sets forth the redistricting criteria. I mentioned that, and I start with that because particularly in relationship to the public hearing process that's beginning, they're wanting the public and communities of interest to provide input regarding this criteria, but there's no law that sets that in place. The General Assembly has the complete power over redistricting, and it's the House election law subcommittees and the Senate redistricting subcommittees that have the authority to determine the criteria that each house will use to create each state, each of their respective house maps, and in addition to separate congressional maps that they each will make. And a redistricting process should be accountable and transparent, that allows the public to provide adequate input and the time for us to engage and have the information to participate within it. And that is not something that happens here. I want us to take a close look at what happens. And so I prepared a couple slides for us to look at what they did in 2011 in terms of the Senate and the House processes. The reason why I want us, or it's important for us to look at these in two houses, because what I want to say is there are two separate processes that are going to take place on the maps. And both of those processes are different. Both of them have different rules, and both of them move at different times according to own discretionary systems. And that's what makes it extremely challenging for the public to engage, because most people don't know that you have to follow what's going on in the House and follow what's going on in the Senate, and they don't have to do the same thing, and they're not coordinated. And more importantly, there's no rules in advance. So the only thing that we have right now to give us a guidance or a glimpse of what they will do is the rules that are set in the subcommittees. And because there's no law, those rules can potentially change every 10-year cycle. So when we look at what happened in 2011, the census results came on time. And it moved from, and I said in the Senate, you have on February 28th, when they announced the beginning of the redistricting process, and it was completed by June 30th. Now, even though I have public hearings down here at 20, I want to run sort of through this. So in the Senate made an announcement that the process was going to begin on February 28th. And a couple days later, the subcommittee had a hearing to organize and receive a briefing from council. And it was on that date that they adopted the public policy for submissions. I highlight that because we have to pay attention to how the public policy that's guiding the process is being made at a subcommittee level. Not even the full Senate, not even the Senate's main committee, but the subcommittee and those selections of people. There was no notice or no advanced publication of what that policy was going to be, but it was approved on that date. At the same time, then a few days later, they announced the Senate public hearing process, and those public hearings began on March 23rd. Similar, by April 13th, at that next subcommittee hearing, that's when they adopted the rules for redistricting. What I want to highlight here is that the rules for redistricting were adopted after the process had begun. The rules for redistricting were adopted after the process had begun. You would think that the rules would impact public notice so that we would know what to say and what to do, but they didn't adopt the rules until afterwards. On April 14th, bills were introduced for the Senate and congressional districts. And then on April 15th, the subcommittee announced that it would begin to accept redistricting proposals. They gave the public 2 weeks notice. 2 weeks to submit plans. Then by June 5th, they had a public hearing on the staff plans and the public submissions for the Senate districts. They gave 5 days notice for that. At least we had 5. A week later, they meet and meet and consider and adopt the House congressional plans. Then the following week, they pass the Senate district plan. The next day, they have a notice of public hearing regarding the congressional plan. And on the 20th, they have public hearings 3 days later. 3 days notice for the public to engage and understand what the congressional districts were going to be or to consider. And then even though I have the last date, it's by the end of June that process was complete. Now, when we look at the House process, it's different. I'll jump back. The bills for the House and congressional districts were introduced on March 30th, and public hearings began on March 30th. I want to jump back. The Senate started earlier. End of February, people had noticed that the process was beginning. Much later notice of what was going on in the House. Now, they have hearings during the month of March and April, and then by April 28th, the Election Law Subcommittee meets on the redistricting criteria, and they adopt on April 28th the guidelines and criteria for congressional and legislative redistricting are adopted. I'm sorry. Once again, the rules and the criteria for which they're going to make the maps and for which we are to gauge are approved after the public hearings. The public hearings are supposed to be the forum by which we are telling them or providing input on the criteria. But we don't know that. And once again, the process is beginning and they're adopting the rules after. It's a reversal. We should know what the rules are before they're beginning so that we know what input needs to be provided. Then, just sort of going through, there's a deadline for the public submission on proposed plans. And now, you see, the deadline for public submission is 2 days before they have a presentation on the proposed House and congressional plans. Then 2 days later, they release the proposed House and congressional plans. So it's interesting when we look at the timing of this. These plans are, if they're releasing the plans by May 20th, they're already drawing and working on those. May, that following week, they're meeting and meeting to convene and consider the House and congressional plans. On the 30th, they release their proposed plan. And by the end of the month, once again, they meet, convene, and are approving the districts. Now, though I have mentioned this sort of like throughout this little bit of talk, the discussion, these are 3 things that I would like, once again, to emphasize as matters of public concern. The House and a Senate adopt their own rules, which are not consistent. Processes aren't consistent, but yet we must be aware and know of that. We receive no notice or education There's no public awareness or education in regards to that. The House and Senate have separate processes for drawing the maps, their respective maps, and congressional maps. They're each drawing separate congressional maps. And the rules and the criteria for redistricting are not guided by law and legislation. They're guided by subcommittee rules that are set in the subcommittee after the process has begun. And that's what is happening right now. Now, naturally, a solution would be a state law, because we who have elected this body, they are to be representatives of the people, by the people, and for the people only. And however, it's our responsibility to secure the constitutional right of the people's political power through the enactment of law that demonstrates our will. This is not happening. So when we talk about what a process should look like, there are certain key elements that should be taking place during a redistricting process. There's by federal law, there must be compliance with the Voting Rights Act to ensure that we don't have any illegal racial gerrymandering or voter suppression. There should be established specific guidelines and procedures that we know in advance of the process. There should be a publicly stated process that's identified and made available prior. The principles and by which they intend to draw the map and how we should participate and what we should follow should be clear. We should know what that is. It shouldn't be vague. We should have clear criteria for how the districts are drawn together and the limits and who can serve on the redistricting committee. Right now, that's at the committee membership is solely at the discretion of the Senate President and the speakers of the House by the leadership, which means the membership of the committee is subject to partisan control. And as we know, the maps have been drawn to partisan control. Key elements: a fair process should recognize and preserve communities of interest to assure a fairer and more transparent outcome that does not splinter or weaken communities. Plans should be created with public input, and it should create accountability to the public for the final plans. There should also be convenient public hearings around the state. There should be an open and accessible website with all of the information. There's a website, and they have posted a website, but I've noticed just in the last few weeks, within the last few days, the information that comes up is not always up there at the same time. I attended the hearing and they said that the notebook with the tabs for what they were discussing would be made available that day. And at the end of the day, I checked and it wasn't there. There's no rules or laws that regulate that. We should have adequate notice for all hearings. I believe at least 7 days in advance, but as a public policy issue, should it be longer? Should it be 14? The public should have the demographic and political data that's used by the redistricting authority, and that should be publicly available. We know that the census results have not been released yet, and the public hearing process has begun. They've begun redistricting before all of the final information has begun. They've begun public hearings for our input without us knowing what's the final census data. We should know what's the software that the legislature, the General Assembly, is going to use to create the maps. And we should know that there's sufficient time for them to modify the plan in response to our public feedback. I don't see that in what they did in 2011, and there's no rules that have been set at this point that lets us know how that will be. The process should also explain to us the rationale for the proposed boundaries with a written and a public report so that we know how this works. That doesn't exist in South Carolina. Now, I want to just sort of go through a little bit of an overview of what are considered generally accepted redistricting criteria. And I'm going to list them. There's compactness. Districts should be compact, having a minimum distance between all parts of a constituency. They should be contiguous, have contiguity. All parts of the district should be connected at some point with the rest of the district. There should be preservation of counties and political subdivision. This means not crossing county, city, town, and other boundaries when drawing lines. Preservation of communities of interest. And I want to spend a little more time on that down the line, but preservation of communities of interest relate to geographical areas such as neighborhoods or city or regions of a state where the residents have a common political interest that don't necessarily coincide with the boundaries of a political subdivision. It should preserve cores of prior districts. And this is a concept that refers to maintaining districts as previously drawn to lead to a continuity of representation. That one could be debatable, but it's been generally accepted. Avoiding pairing incumbents. This refers to avoiding districts that would create contests between incumbents. And there's the concept of a prohibition favoring or disfavoring incumbent party or candidate. The prohibition in a given state could be broader, covering any person or group, or it could be limited to intentionally or unduly favoring a person or group. That's a concept that can, we can dive, all of these are things that we can dive deeper in, but I just wanted to provide a general outline of some of that. Now, the Senate rules in South Carolina, House Subcommittee was the last time, set forth, I'll say, these major areas: population equality, compliance with the Voting Rights Act, avoidance of racial gerrymandering, contiguity, and district compactness. However, I want to get to the point here of communities of interest. Now, I want to talk about the concept, this area, in terms of criteria in slightly a different way. There's been focus on right now, because we're in the public hearing process, that communities of interest need to be identified and participate in the process. And so I want to spend a little time here around this without jumping, diving much deeper into some of the criteria, because this communities of interest is very important, because as a value in redistricting, they are the most challenging for authorities to define. And if communities don't advocate for themselves, they're likely to be defined by those who have different interests or not be considered at all. And so public input is the only way that communities of interest can be self-defined in this process. And it's essential that we as people and groups representing our communities present testimony and review the testimony of other self-identified communities. So how do we do that in this process? And I've spent some time thinking and is sort of evaluating what is it that we need to do that's unique in South Carolina, given the process and the circumstances. And so what's unique about the rules in South Carolina is that the House rules, while they mention communities of interest, they don't define them. And we have maps that are drawn, and we never know how those maps are drawn in the context of communities of interest. Now, communities of interest are central to redistricting and the criteria, and they are interrelated to the other criteria. And so when we talk about the criteria in redistricting, we need to understand the criteria that's being used and the interrelation of those criteria to our communities. And so we're going to have to, as I've realized, we can't cover or dive as deeply as we want, as I would like to in one session. So this is something that's going to have to be an ongoing discussion, not just here and among ourselves, but also down in our communities. However, the challenge is we have a process that's already begun. So what is it that we can do now? We have to educate ourselves and our communities about our redistricting process and encourage them to participate. Sorry for the error. We must testify at public hearings, and we must submit written testimony that pertain to the rules and the criteria. And so the rest of this time, I want to spend, unpacking what I believe, with us, sort of what this call to action means. There is no roadmap that has been paid for us in this unique process. It's a roadmap that we're going to be having to create and pay for us because this is ours. We can't look at another state per se, and we don't have a whole lot of time. So what is it that I want to bring to your attention that's most important? So we have Senate hearings that are in process now from now through August 16th. And we know that the rules aren't going to be set until that next subcommittee hearing after the public hearings. And we also know that we're probably not going to receive a draft of those rules in advance. So the only thing that we're going to be able to look at is probably at the rules that they've used this past time. So what's important at the public hearings is to present testimony about what we think those rules should be. Now, my perspective is we can approach this in sort of two ways. At the hearings, they only give us 3 minutes. So there's no real way that we can really advocate for the rules, major rules, unless we sort of narrow the focus of area in that way. So I'm going to sort of defer to each of you. We're going to have to make individual decisions about how we need to advocate for our communities at the hearing. However, we have a few weeks to prepare a written submission about what we think those rules and what the criteria should be for redistricting, for the redistricting process. And so I'm advocating that we need to spend time, as which I'm planning to do, particularly when I look at my own home community. there's going to have to be written documentation that we all, that as a community we can, and as a citizen, that we can hold our representatives and the committee accountable to. So in order to have that public input, we need to put that in writing and send that to the subcommittee. And so we have time to do that. And so one of the things that and we're gonna have a breakout session in a few minutes, because what I've been thinking about over the next few weeks as part of our Fair Naps program initiative is creating somewhat of a workshop and resources that we can get to you to help you prepare that testimony, so that we can have in writing some documentation that we can hold the committee accountable to, and that you can hold your committee accountable to, and that we can provide and educate them on what we think is important. Now, another thing, I think an important element as it relates to communities of interest is one of the things that we need. It's important to, how do I say? When our representatives in our legislature do not respond to the issues, the public policy issues, and the things that are of concern to us, we know that that's a problem in our representative process. And so this is an opportunity at the public hearings during the representation, is that you should be able to have a choice to choose a candidate of your choice that's going to represent your issues and values. So if there are issues and matters, public policy issues and matters of your community that the legislature or your representative has not addressed, you need to voice your concerns about that. i.e., and I'm just going to give one example, Medicaid expansion. There's no reason for the state of South Carolina to have not expanded Medicaid. We can look at the vast majority of support of people who need it. And if we probably even break down the data, there's probably poor communities that needed Medicaid expansion for healthcare, and their representatives did not vote to support that. That's a problem. So I want you to think about that. At the end of this session, we're going to, I'm going to have sort of like an exit survey that sort of captures some questions that sort of help guide us through this process. But right now, what I would like to do is, I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment and open this up for some questions in general. And then I would like for us to sort of go out into a breakout session for 10 or 15 minutes so that you can discuss in small groups, sort of what you've heard and what you think about and what the concerns. And because this is a collaborative and collective process that we need to get input on. So how do we assist ourselves in our communities to have input? Now, this was just an overview. And I want to highlight for those of you who are interested, we're going to have a packet of resources that are readily available that will include a copy of the House and Senate rules from 2011. That includes the concepts around redistricting criteria. And then there's another thing, element that I want to highlight to you, is that I wrote what was called the FAIR Act, Bill S750, that was introduced in the Senate, in the legislature this past spring. Now, what that bill did was it codified, it took the existing rules that they used the last time and made those rules into a law. So that Fair Act, what it did was try to at least put into law the rules that they used, and they didn't move on it. Now, I don't think that they're ideal because it also included incumbency protection. But I thought it would be hard for them to argue against enacting what they do. But that shows you just how much they want to have that independent discretion to do what they want. Now, what we will have time to do through the next several months is to get input and fine tune another version of our Fair Act that adds greater accountability, to put another version in place, which would be model and ideal. And we'll have some more sessions. My idea right now is I'm thinking of more or less a curriculum or ongoing education around these things that helps us to build awareness and participation in what it should look like, because the legislature is not going to do it. And then how do we get that out and begin to advocate and force for that? So I've talked too long. I'd like to know if there's any questions right now that regarding what I've said, what I've presented, that you'd like to open up to the public, to everyone that's here before we break out.